The tropical morning air hung thick with humidity as an oil-stained wrench tumbled from trembling fingers. Captain Paul Gunn stood frozen before the aircraft that would change everything. This machine represented pure rebellion against military protocol. The modified bomber squatted on the tarmac like a metallic predator. Where smooth glass should have formed the bombardier's nose, 8 massive machine gun barrels protruded instead. Each barrel gleamed dully in the harsh Pacific sunlight. The .50 caliber weapons transformed this B-25 Mitchell from precision bombing platform into something entirely different. This was no longer a medium bomber designed for high-altitude operations. This had become a ship killer, a commerce destroyer, an unauthorized experiment that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force manual. Gunn's commanding officer had never signed off on these modifications. No official paperwork existed for this conversion. The mathematics of Pacific victory were being calculated not in Pentagon war rooms, but in makeshift workshops. Not by generals with stars on their shoulders, but by a 43-year-old maverick fighting his personal vendetta. The path to this moment stretched back through 2 years of desperation and innovation. Back to December 8, 1941, when time zones made it already tomorrow in Manila. Paul Gunn had never been called Pappy by anyone. Not yet. That nickname would come later, earned through actions no one could imagine. On that December morning, he stood at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers methodically erase American air power from Philippine skies. Smoke columns rose from burning hangars. Explosions echoed across the airfield. The sound of aircraft engines mixed with the whistle of falling bombs. The sweet smell of aviation fuel burned in his nostrils. Concrete dust swirled through the tropical air. As manager of Philippine Airlines, Gunn controlled 4 Red Beach 18 civilian aircraft. These were small passenger planes, not military weapons. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer every available aircraft. Gunn would find himself commissioned as a captain in the Army Air Corps. What began as temporary wartime service would stretch into 3 years of innovation and revenge. Gunn was 42 years old. His face showed the weathering of 2 decades in naval aviation. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of countless hours squinting into bright skies. He had served 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator. 20 years of working with his hands on aircraft engines. 20 years of understanding how machines flew and why they sometimes didn't. He had retired in December 1939, thinking his military service was finished. His education came not from engineering textbooks, but from hangar floors. He learned aircraft systems by troubleshooting failures at 3,000 feet. He understood weight and balance because miscalculations meant crashes. He knew weapons systems because he had mounted guns and fired them in combat. In the 1920s, he had learned to fly when aviation was still experimental. Death rates were high. Survival required understanding every bolt and wire in your aircraft. He had served with the legendary Top Hatters Fighter Squadron, where aggression was valued above caution. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, he had instructed younger pilots, passing on hard-won knowledge. But technical expertise meant nothing on that December morning. Gunn faced a more immediate crisis. His family was trapped in Manila as Japanese forces closed in from multiple directions. Clara Louise, called Polly by everyone who knew her, waited with their 4 children. Paul Jr. and Nathan were teenagers, old enough to understand the danger. Connie and Julie were younger, depending completely on their parents for protection. The family had lived comfortably in Manila, while Gunn managed the airline operations. Expatriate life in the Philippines had been pleasant. Servants handled household duties. The children attended good schools. Social life revolved around the American community. That existence had evaporated in a single morning of bombing raids. In the chaotic weeks following December 7th, Gunn flew reconnaissance missions over disintegrating Philippine defenses. Japanese fighters appeared without warning from cloud cover. Anti-aircraft fire burst around his aircraft in black puffs. He dodged enemy patrols, survived being shot down over dense jungle, walked out through hostile territory, and immediately climbed into another aircraft. His distinguished flying cross came from a medical supply mission to Bataan. Flying an unarmed transport through Japanese-controlled airspace required exceptional skill and audacity. Enemy fighters could have shot him down easily. Anti-aircraft guns tracked his flight path. He delivered the medical supplies and returned safely through sheer determination. But he could not reach his family. Japanese advance units moved faster than anyone anticipated. Ground transportation became impossible as enemy forces cut supply lines. The airfield where his family waited evacuation came under direct attack. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn received evacuation orders. Key personnel would be flown to Australia immediately. He drew all his military pay in cash. He borrowed additional money from fellow officers, promising repayment after the war. Everything was prepared for his family's escape. The Japanese advance moved too swiftly. His wife and children could not reach the airfield before Japanese troops surrounded Manila. Communication lines were cut. Ground routes were blocked by enemy forces. Gunn faced an impossible choice: abandon his family or disobey direct orders. Stay meant death or capture without helping anyone. Leave meant abandoning the people he loved most to an enemy known for brutality toward civilians. He flew to Australia because orders were orders, because the war was larger than one family, because staying would accomplish nothing except adding 5 more prisoners to Japanese camps. On January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were rounded up by occupation forces. University of Santa Thomas was converted into an internment camp for enemy civilians. Conditions were harsh. Food was scarce. Medical care was minimal. Guards were often brutal. Something fundamental broke inside Gunn when he learned this news. The man who continued fighting was not the same person who had evacuated Manila. He had left his wife and 4 children in enemy hands. Every day they remained imprisoned was another day he could not protect them. The only weapon he possessed was his ability to end the war faster. If he could not save his family directly, he could destroy every ship carrying Japanese supplies, every aircraft providing enemy air cover, every supply line keeping Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was not official military strategy. This was personal vengeance disguised as tactical innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942, he inherited a disaster. His predecessor had been relieved for incompetence. Morale throughout the command was terrible. Equipment was inadequate for the mission requirements. Japanese forces controlled the air over New Guinea and threatened Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, theater commander, had no confidence in his air forces. MacArthur made his opinion abundantly clear in frequent tirades. The Air Force was failing. Bombing was ineffective. Japanese convoys moved with impunity. Ground forces were dying while air power accomplished nothing. Kenney was 53 years old. His face bore the lean features of a veteran fighter pilot. A World War I ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star for valor. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School, where unconventional thinking was encouraged. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long lecture about air power failures, Kenney listened politely. Then he asked for one thing: authority to send home anyone he considered dead wood. officers who lacked aggression, commanders who followed procedures instead of achieving results. MacArthur, surprised by this direct request, agreed immediately. Within weeks, Kenny had reshuffled his entire command structure. Aggressive younger officers replaced cautious veterans. He created a forward headquarters in New Guinea to speed decision-making processes. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead became his forward commander. Whitehead received authority to change aircraft assignments based on weather and tactical conditions. No more waiting for orders from Brisbane. No more losing opportunities because of bureaucratic delays. But personnel changes meant nothing without effective weapons. Allied bombing from medium and high altitudes was proving catastrophically ineffective against Japanese shipping. High altitude gave ships time to maneuver away from falling bombs. The B-17 flying fortresses were hitting less than 1% of their targets. Mathematical analysis showed this hit rate was worse than random chance. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with complete impunity. Allied ground forces were dying in jungle fighting, while fresh Japanese troops poured ashore from ships that bombers could not sink. Kenny had been thinking about this problem since 1928. As an instructor at the tactical school, he had theorized about skip bombing, releasing bombs at very low altitude so they would skip across water like stones on a pond. The bombs would slam into ship sides below the waterline where armor was weakest. The concept was mathematically sound. Water provided an incompressible medium that would transmit explosive force efficiently. Bombs exploding below the waterline would cause maximum structural damage. The execution was proving extremely difficult. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament adequate for low-level attack. Coming in at mast height meant flying through withering anti-aircraft fire with nothing to suppress the gunners. Ships had time to maneuver away from attacking aircraft. Then Kenny discovered Paul Gunn, and everything changed forever. In August 1942, Kenny learned that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers without authorization. The modifications were crude, but showed remarkable effectiveness. Someone had removed the bombardier from the transparent nose section. 450 caliber machine guns were installed in his place, all firing forward. The idea was to strafe Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing ground fire before dropping bombs. Kenny investigated immediately and found Captain Paul Gunn, working essentially alone in maintenance hangars, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through trial and error experimentation. He possessed no formal engineering degree, but he understood aircraft structures from 2 decades of hands-on experience. Weight distribution, structural loading, weapon systems integration. Most officers would have court-martialed Gunn for modifying military aircraft without authorization. Kenny immediately assigned him to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer. The mission was impossible. Modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack. Do it immediately. Resources were scarce. Time was critical. Gunn worked 18-hour days in sweltering tropical heat. He scrounged weapons from crashed aircraft scattered across New Guinea airfields, fabricated mounting brackets in makeshift workshops using improvised tools. Personally, test flew each modification to ensure it worked properly. He added 450 caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted additional guns along the fuselage sides, installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. Each modification required solving unique engineering challenges. The modified A-20s went into combat in September 1942. Target was a Japanese airfield at Buna, on New Guinea's northern coast. The results exceeded all expectations dramatically. The strafing A-20s came in at treetop level with guns blazing. Streams of 50 caliber bullets swept across enemy positions. Anti-aircraft positions were suppressed before gunners could react. Japanese defenders, accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes, had no time to respond effectively. The attack destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground. Hangars burst into flames. Fuel storage areas exploded in spectacular fireballs. Personnel scattered in panic. The demonstration proved that low-level strafing could revolutionize air warfare tactics. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to begin similar modifications for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was larger than the A-20. Longer range, greater bomb capacity, ability to mount more forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could transform the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the theater. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. Twin-engine aircraft with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by two Wright R2600 radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each. Normal armament consisted of 650 caliber machine guns for defense and 3,000 pounds of bombs. Standard crew consisted of 5 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, bombardier in the glass nose section, radio operator in the central fuselage, tail gunner in the rear section. The aircraft was named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his outspoken views. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually be manufactured. 2 North American aviation plants produced them, one in Inglewood, California, another in Kansas City, Kansas. Production lines operated around the clock to meet wartime demand. The B-25 had gained fame in April 1942. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25s on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, 800 miles from Japan. The raid did minimal physical damage to Japanese targets, but it provided enormous morale boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor. More importantly, it forced Japan to keep fighter aircraft home to defend the mainland rather than sending them to frontline operations. Most importantly for the war effort, the Doolittle raid demonstrated that Japan was vulnerable to air attack. The home islands were not invulnerable sanctuaries. American bombers could reach any target in the Japanese Empire. But the B-25's primary role remained medium-altitude bombing, a mission at which it was proving completely ineffective against ships. Bombs dropped from altitude gave vessels time to maneuver away from impact points. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw potential no one else recognized. The aircraft's nose section was large enough to mount multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine design provided redundancy against battle damage. Losing one engine would not doom the aircraft to crash. The sturdy construction could absorb punishment from anti-aircraft fire. Most importantly, the Mitchell had sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that shorter-range A-20s could not attack. In late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He was working with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in theater. Fox was supposed to ensure aircraft modifications followed factory specifications exactly. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would become the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of the entire war. The first challenge was removing the bombardier and his glass nose section. This saved considerable weight and eliminated a vulnerable position that was useless for low-altitude attack missions. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal nose section, housing 4 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all firing forward and operated by the pilot. Each gun carried 500 rounds of ammunition. Rate of fire was approximately 850 rounds per minute per gun. The pilot could unleash a devastating storm of lead that would shred any target within seconds. But 4 guns were insufficient for Gunn's vision. He added 2 more 50 caliber guns in cheek blisters. These package guns were mounted on either side of the forward fuselage, just below and behind the cockpit area. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc. This allowed them to fire without bullets passing through the propeller disc. They were fixed in the forward firing position, adding to the pilot's firepower concentration. Then Gunn made his most radical decision yet. The B-25 had a dorsal turret with twin 50 caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. This turret could rotate to defend against attacks from above and behind the aircraft. Gunn locked the turret in the forward firing position permanently, adding 2 more guns to the pilot's control systems. The co-pilot could operate these guns using a sight installed in the cockpit. Alternatively, the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously using a master trigger system. Now, the modified B-25 mounted 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second. For comparison, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50 caliber guns. The modified B-25 had forward firepower exceeding more than 1 fighter aircraft, concentrated in a platform that also carried 2,000 pounds of bombs. The firepower concentration was unprecedented in aviation history. The modifications created significant engineering challenges that required innovative solutions. Adding weight to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and difficult to control during flight operations. Gunn compensated by repositioning equipment toward the rear, ballasting the tail section with additional weight. Careful calculations ensured the aircraft remained controllable throughout its flight envelope. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing simultaneously created severe structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing members, strengthening mounting points to withstand the tremendous forces generated. The guns generated tremendous heat and choking smoke during sustained firing. Gunn added ventilation systems to clear gun smoke from the cockpit. He moved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk from tracer rounds. Most critically, Gunn had to solve the complex problem of gun harmonization. The 8 guns needed to converge their fire at a specific point in front of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards from the muzzles. If the guns were not properly aligned, bullets would spray everywhere except the intended target. Gunn developed a ground testing procedure using targets placed at measured distances from the aircraft. He adjusted each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged precisely at the desired range. He tested the guns personally, making minute adjustments repeatedly, refusing to sign off on any aircraft until it met his exacting standards. The entire modification process required approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when working around the clock. Gunn trained maintenance crews to perform the specialized work, establishing production line techniques to speed the conversion process. By December 1942, he had modified sufficient B-25s to equip the 42nd Bombardment Squadron. The squadron needed a commander who understood low-altitude attack tactics, someone not afraid to violate conventional bombing doctrine completely. Kenny selected Major Ed Larner, a pilot who had risen from first lieutenant to major in just a few weeks. His rapid promotion was due entirely to aggressive leadership in combat operations. Larner had demonstrated exceptional skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenny's complete trust. Larner and Gunn developed the tactics that would transform naval warfare forever. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water surface. Flying at maximum speed, approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they were nearly impossible for ship gunners to track effectively. The closing speed was too fast for manual gun laying. Most importantly, the aircraft were already past the target before gunners could adjust their aim. As the B-25s approached their targets, pilots would open fire with all 8 forward guns, beginning at approximately 1,000 yards range, walking the concentrated fire into the target ship systematically. The stream of 50-caliber bullets would sweep the decks clean, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft gunners before they could respond, destroying gun positions and communication equipment, shredding superstructures, and creating absolute chaos among the crew. The purpose was not to sink ships with gunfire alone, although the damage could be quite substantial. The purpose was to silence the ship's defensive systems completely. Most importantly, to create terror and confusion among the crew members. Then came the bombs that would finish the job. At a range of approximately 200 to 400 yards from the target, flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb equipped with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour, strike the water surface at high speed, skip across the surface like a stone thrown by a child. The bomb would bounce once, perhaps twice, then slam into the side of the ship at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb would not explode on initial impact with the water. Instead, it would penetrate the ship's hull completely, sink slightly beneath the surface level, then detonate with devastating effect. The explosion occurred in the most vulnerable part of any ship, below the armor belt, where hull plating was thinnest. The blast effect was enhanced by the incompressibility of water, which transmitted shock waves with devastating efficiency throughout the target vessel. A single bomb exploding below the waterline could break a ship's keel structure, rupture fuel tanks and flood engine rooms, cause catastrophic structural failure that would sink even large vessels quickly. By the time the bomb detonated, the attacking B-25 was already past the target, climbing rapidly to avoid the blast effects and secondary explosions. The entire attack sequence, from first gunshots to bomb release, took approximately 10 seconds. Skip bombing techniques were not entirely new in warfare. The British had experimented with similar methods against German shipping. Some American pilots had tried it independently with varying degrees of success. But combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's revolutionary innovation. The strafing nose turned the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defensive fire before dropping bombs on the helpless target. This combination would prove absolutely devastating in combat operations. While Gunn was modifying aircraft in Australian workshops, Allied intelligence was monitoring Japanese naval movements throughout the Pacific. Ultra Intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided detailed information about enemy operational plans. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known by the acronym FRUMEL, was reading Japanese messages almost in real time. In late February 1943, FRUMEL intercepted messages indicating a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul, the fortress on the island of New Britain that served as Japan's primary base in the southwest Pacific. The convoy's destination was Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea. The cargo consisted of troops and supplies for Japanese forces fighting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was remarkably specific and detailed. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops, members of the elite 51st Division being transferred from China to New Guinea. 8 destroyers would provide escort against submarine and air attack. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943. Arrive at Lae approximately 3 days later after careful navigation through Allied patrol areas. This represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea operations. If the convoy succeeded in delivering its cargo, Japanese forces would be strengthened significantly, potentially stopping Allied advances toward Rabaul itself. If the convoy failed completely, Japan would lose thousands of experienced troops. More importantly, Japan would likely never attempt another major reinforcement operation by sea. The risk would be too great, the losses too severe. General Kenny saw an unprecedented opportunity to test his modified aircraft and revolutionary tactics against the most important targets to appear since Pearl Harbor. He assembled every available aircraft in the theater for a massive coordinated attack. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover against Japanese interceptors. Most importantly, the modified B-25 strafers would execute skip bombing attacks. It would be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Multiple aircraft types attacking from different altitudes and directions. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were explicit and uncompromising. Find the convoy wherever it might be hiding. Attack without mercy or hesitation. Give no quarter to any target. This was not a harassment raid or reconnaissance mission. This was complete annihilation of enemy forces. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the operation from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 cargo transports carrying troops and supplies. Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Aiyo Maru, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers provided escort protection against submarine and air attacks. Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly air cover during the dangerous voyage. The convoy represented the strongest force Japan had assembled for any resupply mission. Kimura expected to lose ships during the passage. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered significant losses from Allied air and submarine attacks. But Japanese commanders believed enough ships would survive the voyage to deliver the critically needed troops. They were completely and catastrophically wrong about that assumption. The convoy was spotted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on routine patrol. The aircrew immediately radioed the position, course, and detailed composition to headquarters. Kenny's command launched additional reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact. Weather initially favored the Japanese convoy. 2 tropical storms moved through the operational area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility significantly. Allied aircraft maintained intermittent contact, but could not attack effectively through the severe weather conditions. The convoy made steady progress toward its destination. Moving at 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour. The slow speed was dictated by the heavily loaded transport vessels. The destroyers could have achieved 20 knots or more, but they had to match the convoy's maximum sustainable speed. By nightfall on March the 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles. They were roughly halfway to their destination at Leh. Weather was deteriorating further, which Kimura welcomed enthusiastically. Poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft could find and attack his convoy. But the storms also meant rough seas that pounded the transport vessels mercilessly. Troops crowded below decks in the cargo holds suffered terribly from seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, weather conditions improved slightly. Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained visual contact with the convoy. At approximately 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet altitude. The high-altitude bombing proved predictably ineffective against maneuvering ships. The B-17 crews claimed multiple hits on various targets, but Japanese records indicate only minimal damage to one transport vessel. The attack served one important strategic purpose. It forced the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing progress toward the destination significantly. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued from various altitudes. The flying fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from different approach angles. Ships maneuvered frantically to avoid the falling ordnance. Japanese fighter aircraft engaged the bombers in running battles. Several B-17s sustained battle damage, but returned to base. 3 Japanese fighters were shot down by bomber gunners. But no ships were sunk by the high-altitude attacks. The bombing raids were successfully harassing the convoy and slowing its progress. But they were not stopping the mission or sinking the transports. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the critical attack would come the following morning. The modified B-25s were ready for combat operations. Major Larner had briefed his pilots repeatedly on the new tactics. They had rehearsed the attack profile on a wrecked ship target. Every pilot understood the mission requirements perfectly. The skip bombing technique had been practiced extensively. The strafing guns had been harmonized precisely. The ordnance had been loaded and checked. The point of no return was rapidly approaching. At dawn on March 3, 1943, weather conditions were perfect for a major air attack operation. Clear skies stretched to every horizon. Visibility was unlimited in all directions. Seas were relatively calm with minimal wave action. Rear Admiral Kimura must have felt a chill of premonition as he studied the perfect attack weather. His convoy was approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough that land-based anti-aircraft guns could provide some defensive support, but still vulnerable to concentrated air attack from multiple directions. The Allied strike force assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy, including B-17 flying fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters providing escort coverage. Multiple attack waves would strike from different directions throughout the day. The assault began at approximately 10 in the morning. The B-17 struck first from medium altitude, diverting attention and forcing ships to maneuver defensively. Then the low-altitude aircraft arrived for the killing blow. The Beaufighters struck first. These deadly aircraft swept down from the sky with devastating precision. 4 20mm cannons blazed from each nose. 6 machine guns added their thunder to the assault. The combination was overwhelming. Their mission was simple, but crucial. Suppress the anti-aircraft guns before the real killing began. Japanese destroyers responded with everything in their arsenal. Gun crews swung their weapons skyward. Tracers streaked through the morning air. Shells burst in angry black puffs around the attacking aircraft. But the closing speed was impossible to counter. The fighters moved too fast for effective tracking. Then the modified B-25 strafers appeared on the horizon. The slaughter commenced immediately. Wave after wave of modified B-25 strafers thundered in throughout that blood-soaked morning. Each pilot selected his target with methodical precision. One aviator fixed his attention on the transport Kyoku Samaru. The vessel sat low in the water, heavy with troops and supplies. Steam rose from her stacks. Men moved across her decks like ants. The pilot pushed his control stick forward. The bomber's nose dropped toward the churning sea below, 50 feet above the water now. Salt spray from the waves nearly touched the aircraft's belly. The ocean rushed beneath them in a blue-green blur. 1,000 yards from target. Time to unleash hell. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The combined rate of fire reached 6,800 rounds per minute. That translated to 180 pounds of projectiles every single second. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Tracer rounds showed exactly where death was heading. The stream of fire walked methodically from the transport's bow toward her superstructure. Everything in the path of those bullets disintegrated instantly. Japanese sailors were cut down where they stood. Bodies crumpled to blood-stained decks. Anti-aircraft gun positions exploded under the withering fire. Gun shields were shredded like paper. The bridge structure began disintegrating under the relentless impacts. Metal fragments flew in every direction. Glass windows shattered. Equipment sparked and died. Then the pilot released his bombs. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses dropped away from the aircraft's belly. They struck the water exactly 200 yards from the ship's hull. The bombs skipped once across the surface like deadly stones. Physics and timing had to be perfect. Too steep, and they would penetrate the water and detonate harmlessly below. Too shallow, and they would skip over the target entirely. These hit perfectly. The bombs slammed into Kyoku Samaru's hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled back on his controls and banked sharply away from the target. Behind him, delayed fuses counted down their final seconds. The underwater explosions were massive beyond description. Twin detonations ripped the bottom completely out of Kyoku Samaru. The transport lurched violently, as if struck by a giant fist. Water poured into the engine room with tremendous force. More water flooded the cargo holds, where troops waited in terror. The ship began settling immediately into the dark Pacific waters. She listed heavily to port as compartments flooded. 15 minutes later, Kyoku Samaru would disappear beneath the waves forever. But there was no time to watch her die. Other modified B-25s were already beginning their attack runs. Each pilot followed identical procedures. Select target. Dive to minimum altitude. Open fire at optimal range. Release bombs at precisely calculated distance. Pull up and escape. The routine was methodical and devastating. Guns blazing like dragons breathing fire. Bombs skipping across water with deadly accuracy. Ships exploding in thunderous eruptions. The transport Kenbu Maru attracted multiple attackers. At least 3 B-25 strafers converged on the vessel simultaneously. The combined gunfire was apocalyptic in its intensity. Most of the crew above decks died within the first 30 seconds. Bodies littered every exposed surface. Blood ran in rivulets across tilted decks. 4 bombs found their mark below the waterline. The explosions broke Kenbu Maru completely in half. The forward section rolled over immediately. The stern portion hung suspended for a moment before following its companion into the depths. Less than 10 minutes elapsed from first attack to final disappearance. The ship took nearly 1,000 Japanese troops to the bottom with her. Teo Maru suffered equally devastating treatment. Strafing fire was so intense that fires erupted across her entire superstructure. Flames consumed everything combustible. Smoke poured from shattered windows and torn metal. 2 bombs opened massive holes in her hull below the waterline. The ocean rushed in with unstoppable force. The transport went down with her human cargo still trapped in flooding compartments below. Nojima attempted desperate evasive maneuvers. The captain ordered emergency turns. The ship's wake curved frantically across the water. But transports were not built for speed or agility. A B-25 strafer raked the vessel from stern to bow with methodical precision. Every gun position was systematically destroyed. Then, 2 bombs punched into the engine room. Power died instantly throughout the ship. Emergency lighting flickered and failed. The vessel began taking on massive amounts of water through the bomb holes. She would sink later that same day, joining her sister ships on the ocean floor. The bow fighters and remaining B-25s turned their attention to the escort destroyers. These warships carried heavier armament and more experienced crews, but they were not prepared for the overwhelming firepower now directed against them. Destroyer Shirayuki served as Admiral Kimura's flagship. The admiral stood on her bridge, directing the convoy's desperate defense. Strafing fire from a B-25 swept across the bridge structure like a scythe through wheat. Almost everyone on the bridge died instantly. Admiral Kimura was wounded, but still alive when the bomb struck near the stern. The explosion started fires in the ammunition magazine. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession. Each detonation was larger than the last, as more ammunition cooked off. The final explosion blew the entire stern section completely off the destroyer. Shirayuki sank within minutes, taking most of her crew to the bottom. Tokitsukaze received direct bomb hits that ignited her fuel tanks. Burning gasoline spread across the water around the destroyer. The ship became a floating inferno visible for miles. Flames reached hundreds of feet into the air. Explosions echoed across the water as ammunition and fuel continued to detonate. The destroyer sank within the hour, still burning as she disappeared. Arashio suffered a different but equally fatal injury. While maneuvering frantically to avoid bombs, she collided with the damaged transport Nojima. The impact crushed her bow and opened seams throughout her forward compartments. Water flooded in faster than pumps could handle. The crew abandoned ship as she settled deeper into the water. Throughout this devastating attack, Japanese Zero fighters tried desperately to protect the convoy. These pilots were among the best in the Imperial Navy. They dove from high altitude in suicide attacks against the American bombers, but the P-38 Lightnings engaged them at high altitude, where Zeros were most vulnerable. Meanwhile, the B-25s operated at masthead height, where enemy fighters could not safely attack without risking collision with their own ships. The coordination between American aircraft types was absolutely perfect. High cover and low attack worked in seamless combination. The entire attack lasted approximately 40 minutes. When the Allied aircraft finally withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene behind them was purely apocalyptic. 4 Japanese transports were either sinking or already beneath the waves. 3 destroyers had been completely destroyed. The remaining ships were scattered across miles of ocean. Some showed visible damage from near misses and strafing. All were in complete chaos as crews fought fires and flooding. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors floated in the water among debris and oil slicks. Bodies drifted between pieces of wreckage. Oil slicks burned on the surface, creating pillars of black smoke. The smell of burning fuel and explosives hung heavy in the air. Survivors clung to floating debris and called for rescue that might never come. That afternoon brought no respite for the Japanese survivors. Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes against any ships still afloat. The modified B-25s found the remaining vessels limping slowly toward Leh. These follow-up attacks were methodical and absolutely merciless. Each surviving ship was targeted individually for complete destruction. The strafer B-25s approached at their signature low altitude. Guns blazed from multiple positions as they closed range. Bombs skipped across the water with practiced precision. More transports disappeared beneath the waves forever. The destroyer Asashio, already damaged from the morning attacks, took additional bombs amidships and went under with all hands. By nightfall on March 3rd, the destruction was complete and total. All 8 Japanese transports had been sunk. 4 of the 8 escort destroyers lay on the ocean floor. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning in the dark Pacific waters. Another 2,700 would eventually be rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops would eventually reach Leh. Most arrived without weapons or essential equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked for this critical mission, more than 5,700 had become casualties. The entire convoy had been completely annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light, by any measure. One B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 3 P-38 Lightning fighters were lost in aerial combat with Japanese Zeros. 13 American aircrew members were killed in action. Compared to the devastating Japanese losses, it barely qualified as a skirmish. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as historians would later name it, represented a critical turning point in the entire Pacific War. The results demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft could destroy even heavily escorted naval convoys. The battle proved beyond doubt that skip bombing techniques, when combined with overwhelming forward-firing firepower, could achieve devastating results. Most importantly, it validated every single modification that Gunn had made to the standard B-25 Mitchell bomber. His unauthorized changes had created a weapon system capable of destroying enemy shipping with unprecedented efficiency. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to Japanese military leaders. The battle convinced Japan that resupplying forward garrisons by sea transport in the Southwest Pacific was no longer feasible. The risks had become completely unacceptable. Never again would Japan attempt to move a major convoy to New Guinea through waters controlled by Allied air power. Japanese forces already stationed there would slowly starve and wither as supplies dwindled to nothing. They would fight on with characteristic courage, but they were doomed from the moment their supply line was severed. General MacArthur issued an official communiqué claiming 22 enemy ships sunk. His report included 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers among the victims. The statement claimed over 12,000 enemy troops killed in the action. The actual numbers were somewhat lower, but still represented a devastating defeat for Japan. The exaggerations were typical of wartime propaganda from all sides. Military commanders routinely inflated enemy losses and minimized their own casualties. What mattered far more than precise numbers was the strategic impact of the victory. General Kenny had proven that his tactical concepts actually worked in combat. Skip bombing was not just theoretically viable, but practically devastating. Modified bombers were incredibly effective against naval targets. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defensive fire from escort vessels. Paul Gunn, monitoring reports from his base in Australia, must have felt grim satisfaction as the news arrived. His unauthorized modifications had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops who would never reach their destination. His innovations had shortened the war and saved Allied lives, but his family remained imprisoned in Santo Tomas internment camp. The war was far from over. Liberation seemed closer, but was not yet achieved. The spectacular success of the Battle of Bismarck Sea led to immediate expansion of the modification program throughout the theater. General Kenny ordered all available B-25 Mitchell bombers converted to strafer configuration as quickly as possible. Paul Gunn worked even harder than before, training additional maintenance crews, refining installation techniques and increasing production rates. By mid-1943, most B-25 bombers in the Southwest Pacific had been modified according to Gunn's specifications. The transformation was remarkable in its scope and speed. What had begun as one man's desperate innovation had become standard equipment for an entire theater of operations. North American Aviation, the original manufacturer, took notice of these field modifications. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops in Australia. They examined the modifications in detail and requested complete specifications for all changes. The company wanted to incorporate Gunn's innovations directly into factory production lines. Paul Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States. His mission was to work with North American Aviation at their Inglewood and Kansas City manufacturing plants. He spent several months in 1943 and early 1944 working directly with company engineers to design factory-produced strafer versions of the B-25 Mitchell. The result was the B-25G variant, which mounted a massive 75mm cannon in the nose position. The weapon was supplemented by 4 50-caliber machine guns for additional firepower. A total of 405 B-25G aircraft were eventually built according to these specifications. The 75mm cannon fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of penetrating ship armor or destroying fortified bunkers. The weapon represented the ultimate expression of the gunship concept that Gunn had pioneered. Single shots could cripple or sink enemy vessels, but the cannon proved difficult to load in combat conditions. It required a dedicated crew member positioned in the nose compartment. The weapon's rate of fire was necessarily slow compared to machine guns. These limitations reduced its practical effectiveness in fast-moving combat situations. Gunn personally tested the B-25G variant in actual combat conditions. He led a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer operating near New Guinea. His 75mm cannon shot struck the enemy vessel's fire control system, disabling the ship's ability to coordinate its defensive guns effectively. The destroyer was subsequently sunk by conventional bombs dropped by other aircraft in the formation. Gunn publicly claimed that he had sunk the destroyer with his cannon shot alone. However, he privately admitted to fellow officers that the bombs had finished the job. The B-25H model followed the G variant into full production. 1,000 B-25AH aircraft were eventually built with the 75mm cannon and 14 50-caliber machine guns arranged in various positions throughout the aircraft. The H model relocated the dorsal gun turret forward and eliminated the co-pilot position to save weight. The navigator assumed responsibility for loading the nose cannon. This massive concentration of firepower came at significant cost. The B-25H was extremely nose-heavy and difficult to control in flight. Pilots required additional training to handle the unusual flight characteristics safely. The aircraft wanted to pitch nose down constantly, requiring constant back pressure on the control stick. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's primary development center, sent Paul Gunn an official message. The communication stated that the H model modification was potentially dangerous. All aircraft should be grounded immediately until the center of gravity issue could be properly resolved through engineering analysis. According to legend, Gunn replied immediately with a terse message of his own. He supposedly wrote back, "Put center of gravity concerns in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." The story may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captured Gunn's practical attitude toward technical perfection versus combat effectiveness. Technical perfection mattered far less than the ability to destroy enemy targets. If pilots could learn to compensate for handling issues, the aircraft remained useful in combat. The massive firepower more than justified the additional training requirements. The final production variant was designated the B-25J. This model reverted to a conventional bombardier nose on some aircraft while retaining the strafer nose configuration on others. A total of 4,118 B-25J aircraft were built, making it the most numerous variant of the entire Mitchell series. Some B-25J strafer variants were equipped with 8 forward-firing guns in the solid nose. 4 additional guns were mounted in cheek blisters on either side of the fuselage. 2 more guns occupied the dorsal turret position. 4 guns were installed in waist positions for lateral defense. Total armament could reach 18 50-caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. This represented the most heavily armed bomber of World War II by any measure. The firepower was probably unnecessary in most tactical situations, but it had tremendous psychological impact on enemy forces. The sight and sound of 18 machine guns firing simultaneously was absolutely terrifying. Japanese troops throughout the Pacific learned to fear the distinctive sound of Wright R-2600 engines approaching at low altitude. That particular roar meant death was incoming at 300 miles per hour. There was nowhere to hide from that much firepower concentrated in a single aircraft. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25 strafers devastated Japanese targets across the entire Pacific theater. The aircraft ranged from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, destroying everything that moved on land or sea. Their reputation grew with each successful mission. In August 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea. The coordinated raids destroyed 174 enemy aircraft on the ground in a single day. This devastating blow broke the back of Japanese air power in the entire region. Enemy pilots could not replace losses fast enough to maintain effective resistance. The Wewak raids were only possible because Gunn had solved another critical tactical problem. Range limitations had previously restricted B-25 operations to targets within a few hundred miles of base. Wewak sat at the absolute limit of standard range capabilities. Gunn developed an ingenious technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried in the bomb bay. Once the additional fuel was consumed during flight to target, the empty tanks were simply jettisoned through an open bomb bay door. The system was admittedly crude, with fuel fumes permeating the entire fuselage and wind blowing through the aircraft, but it extended operational range by several hundred critical miles. The Wewak raids ended Japanese air superiority over New Guinea permanently. Allied ground forces could now advance with minimal air opposition from enemy fighters. The strategic impact was enormous and immediate. In November 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Rabaul Harbor in one of the war's most spectacular and daring raids. Major Raymond Jock Hennebrey led 38 B-25 strafers against shipping concentrated in the heavily defended harbor. The attack occurred at masthead height, with P-38 Lightning fighters providing high-altitude cover. Phosphorus bombs created smoke screens that concealed the attacking bombers until the final moments before weapon release. Of 38 enemy vessels anchored in the harbor, 30 received direct bomb hits. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transport and support ships were sunk or severely damaged. The raid paralyzed Rabaul as a forward Japanese base. It demonstrated conclusively that even the strongest enemy positions remained vulnerable to properly executed attacks by modified B-25 strafers. No target was too heavily defended if tactics and timing were correct. During the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers provided close air support for advancing ground forces. They destroyed Japanese supply lines throughout the archipelago. They attacked enemy shipping wherever it could be found. The aircraft became known among Japanese troops as the Bat out of Hell because attacks came so fast and low that defenders had no time to react effectively. Gunn's modified B-25s were certainly not the only weapons winning the Pacific War. Victory required contributions from millions of people using thousands of different weapons over 4 years of global conflict. But the modified Strafer bombers were among the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. They destroyed hundreds of enemy ships of all sizes. They eliminated thousands of aircraft caught on the ground. They killed tens of thousands of enemy troops who never reached their intended destinations. Most importantly, they enabled MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by isolating Japanese garrisons from any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. They gave Allied forces the air superiority that made amphibious landings possible against defended beaches. Without control of the air, such operations would have been prohibitively expensive in casualties. Gunn's personal war continued throughout this entire period of tactical success. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Letters occasionally reached him through Red Cross channels, but communication was sporadic and heavily censored by Japanese authorities. He knew from these limited communications that conditions in the camp were steadily deteriorating. Japanese guards became increasingly harsh as the war turned against their nation. Food became progressively more scarce as supply lines were disrupted. Disease spread through the overcrowded facilities as sanitation systems failed. Gunn could do absolutely nothing to help his family except fight harder. He hoped that each successful mission brought the war's end measurably closer. Every enemy ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every supply convoy eliminated, shortened the conflict by some small amount. In late 1944, American forces successfully invaded Leyte in the Philippines. General MacArthur had returned as promised. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at age 45, still searching for ways to destroy the enemy more efficiently than ever before. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers managed to penetrate Allied defenses and attack Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn was on the ground performing maintenance duties when white phosphorus bombs exploded nearby. Metal fragments tore into his right shoulder, causing massive tissue damage and nerve injury. The wound was severe enough to render his right arm completely useless. The pain was excruciating and would persist for the rest of his life. He was immediately evacuated to Australia for emergency medical treatment. Recovery would require months of surgery and rehabilitation. The injury effectively ended Gunn's combat flying career, but his personal war was nearly over anyway. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division formed a flying column that raced through Manila's burning streets. Their destination was Santo Tomas internment camp, where over 4,000 Allied civilians had been imprisoned for 3 years. The cavalry arrived just as Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp's leadership in a final act of spite. In the chaos of Manila's street fighting, American soldiers freed all the surviving internees. Among them were Paul Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 14 days of increasingly harsh internment. The family was emaciated from malnutrition, traumatized by years of uncertainty, but miraculously still alive. General MacArthur personally visited the liberated camp shortly after its capture. He met the Gunn family and arranged for them to be flown immediately to Australia to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The reunion occurred several weeks after liberation. The man who had left Manila on Christmas Eve 1941 finally held his family again, after more than 3 years of separation. Polly had somehow kept all 4 children together through impossible circumstances. The boys, now young men, had survived the separation when male and female quarters were established. The girls had endured years of progressive deprivation and fear. They were together again, but they were fundamentally different people than they had been. The war had changed them all in ways that would never fully heal. Gunn remained in the Army Air Forces after recovering sufficiently from his wounds. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modifications and tactical development programs. However, he no longer flew combat missions due to his permanent disability. He retired from military service on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired due to his combat injuries. His military decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross, with one oak leaf cluster indicating a second award. He also received the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts representing 9 separate occasions when he was wounded or injured in combat. 9 Purple Hearts represented an extraordinary record of personal sacrifice and dedication to duty. Following military retirement, Gunn returned to the Philippines and worked to re-establish Philippine Airlines. The entire country was rebuilding from years of Japanese occupation and the massive destruction caused by liberation fighting. Gunn helped restore essential air transportation, reconnecting islands that had been completely isolated during the war. He was still flying civilian aircraft, still taking calculated risks, still pushing operational limits whenever possible. Aviation remained his passion despite his physical limitations and advancing age. On October 11, 1957, just 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was piloting a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a severe tropical storm. Weather conditions exceeded safe flying parameters. The plane crashed in the storm. Paul Irvin "Pappy" Gunn died doing exactly what he had done for nearly 40 years of his adult life: flying. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. This was the same facility where he had once served as a flight instructor in the years before World War II. His final resting place was among other aviators who had dedicated their lives to flight. Gunn's legacy lived on in multiple important forms after his death. The B-25 Strafer modifications he had pioneered remained standard throughout the remainder of World War II. 2. Approximately 9,895 B-25 Mitchell bombers were built during the war, and thousands were eventually configured as strafers based directly on Gunn's original designs. His innovations had become an integral part of Allied air power. The skip bombing technique he helped perfect destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships throughout the Pacific Campaign. This tactical innovation contributed significantly to ultimate Allied victory by severing enemy supply lines and isolating forward garrisons from reinforcement or resupply. Most importantly, Gunn had demonstrated that crucial innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. His modifications were created in a maintenance hangar by a grieving father, desperate to strike back at his family's captors. The official military bureaucracy had wanted to fight World War II using existing weapons and approved tactics developed before the war. Gunn proved that desperate circumstances required desperate innovations. Traditional military thinking was inadequate when facing new tactical situations. Individual initiative and unauthorized experimentation could produce weapons more effective than anything developed through normal channels. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a standard case study in military academies worldwide. The engagement demonstrated what could be accomplished through proper combination of intelligence gathering, inter-service coordination, innovative weapons, and unconventional tactics. Complete victory had been achieved at absolutely minimal cost to Allied forces. 8 enemy transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 Japanese casualties, all accomplished with the loss of just 4 Allied aircraft and 13 aircrew members. The mathematical equation was simple and absolutely brutal in its implications. Military units could not survive in any environment where the enemy controlled the air. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of missions that would never be flown, hundreds of troops who would never fight, thousands of rounds of ammunition that would never be fired against Allied forces. Destroying supplies and reinforcements before they reached the battlefield represented the most efficient possible form of warfare. Resources eliminated during transport could never contribute to enemy combat capability. The modified B-25 Strafer had become the weapon system that made such efficient destruction possible on a large scale. It could range hundreds of miles from base to locate enemy shipping. It could suppress defensive fire with overwhelming forward firepower. It could destroy targets with precisely delivered skip bombing attacks. Then it could return to base for immediate rearmament and another mission the same day. A single B-25 Strafer could accomplish what had previously required coordinated attacks by multiple different aircraft types. The efficiency gain was enormous and immediately apparent to tactical commanders throughout the Pacific theater. Japan learned these painful lessons far too late to affect the war's outcome. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese commanders knew with absolute certainty that they could no longer move large convoys during daylight hours within range of Allied air bases. The risk of complete annihilation was simply unacceptable. They switched to nighttime convoy movements whenever possible. They increasingly relied on submarines for transporting critical supplies to isolated garrisons. They used small barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters during daylight hours and move only in darkness. These defensive measures reduced losses somewhat, but did not eliminate them entirely. B-25 Strafers proved equally effective at hunting coastal barges, with the same deadly efficiency they had demonstrated against major shipping. Night-flying B-25s equipped with primitive radar systems found convoys even in complete darkness. There was no safe time, no safe method, no safe route for Japanese logistics operations anywhere in the Southwest Pacific. The stranglehold tightened progressively month by month until Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated from all outside support. Throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and countless Pacific islands, Japanese troops continued fighting with characteristic courage and tenacity. But they did so with steadily dwindling supplies and absolutely no hope of reinforcement or resupply. Their bravery was unquestionable, but air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25 Strafer made their courage strategically irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 Strafer had become the standard anti-shipping weapon throughout the Pacific theater. The aircraft had evolved through the B-25G, H, and J variants, each incorporating increasingly heavy armament configurations. But the basic operational concept remained exactly what Gunn had originally envisioned: a medium bomber converted into a flying gun platform capable of suppressing enemy defenses and delivering devastating attacks at minimum altitude. The concept had proven so successful that it influenced aircraft design for decades after the war ended. When World War II finally ended in August 1945, modified B-25 Strafers were still flying combat missions against remaining Japanese positions. Ironically, they were among the aircraft that provided escort for the Japanese surrender delegation flying from Japan to Manila in mid-August 1945. It seemed fitting that aircraft which had contributed so significantly to Japan's defeat would witness the formal surrender ceremony. Post-war analysis conducted by both American and Japanese military historians confirmed the tremendous significance of Gunn's tactical innovations. Japanese naval officers interviewed after the war stated unanimously that following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they knew with certainty that they could not safely operate surface vessels in any waters within range of Allied air bases. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Convoy commanders knew that low-flying Strafer bombers could appear without any advance warning and destroy entire formations before defensive measures could be implemented. The fear was as effective as the actual attacks in disrupting Japanese logistics. Modified B-25 strafers had created an entirely new type of warfare. Medium bombers now hunted enemy ships with the stealth efficiency of submarines combined with the raw firepower of heavy cruisers. The tactical implications extended far beyond the Pacific War and influenced military thinking for generations. Post-war air forces around the world studied the lessons of skip bombing and concentrated forward-firing armament. The concept of the dedicated gunship, an aircraft designed primarily for gun attacks rather than conventional bombing, became standard doctrine in many nations' air forces. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships employed extensively in Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts were direct conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25 strafers. The lineage was clear and undeniable. Of the 9,890 B-25 Mitchell bombers constructed during World War II, over 100 examples survive today. Most are preserved in the United States at various museums and airfields. Many remain in actual flying condition and appear regularly at air shows where crowds marvel at their impressive size, distinctive sound, and remarkable combat history. The unmistakable roar of twin Wright R-2600 engines is absolutely unforgettable to anyone who has heard it. The sight of a B-25 banking low over an airfield, exactly as they once did over Japanese shipping, provides modern observers with a visceral reminder of what these aircraft actually accomplished during wartime. Several flying B-25s have been restored to strafer configuration with forward-firing guns mounted in the nose. When these weapons are fired during air show demonstrations using blank ammunition, the sound is completely overwhelming. Muzzle blasts are clearly visible. The entire aircraft shudders noticeably from weapon recoil. Watching a B-25 strafer demonstration gives contemporary viewers a small glimpse of what Japanese sailors experienced during the final seconds before their ships were destroyed. The experience is both educational and sobering. Museums worldwide display B-25 Mitchell bombers in various historical configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, maintains multiple examples representing different variants. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once served as an instructor, displays a B-25 in his honor. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington preserves the complete history of these remarkable aircraft. Each surviving bomber tells the story of innovation born from desperation, individual initiative overcoming institutional resistance, and ultimate victory achieved through unconventional means. In 1959, General George Kenney published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a comprehensive biography of the man whose unauthorized innovations had fundamentally changed the Pacific War. Kenney, by then retired from active duty, wanted to ensure that Gunn's crucial contributions would not be forgotten by future generations. The book detailed Gunn's mechanical modifications, his personal combat missions, and his private war to free his imprisoned family. Kenney wrote that Gunn represented one of the most important individuals in the entire Pacific War, a man whose unauthorized actions had saved thousands of Allied lives and measurably shortened the global conflict. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, later wrote additional books about his father's remarkable story. These publications provided the family perspective, describing daily life in Santo Tomas internment camp and the long, uncertain wait for liberation that never seemed to come. The Gunn family story became a powerful example of the human cost of warfare and the extraordinary strength required to endure years of uncertainty and deprivation. Their experience represented thousands of similar families throughout the Pacific who suffered under Japanese occupation. In 1975, the United States Air Force honored Paul Gunn posthumously by naming a training facility in his memory. The recognition was long overdue, but deeply heartfelt. Gunn had never sought personal glory or public recognition during his lifetime. He had sought only effectiveness against the enemy who held his family prisoner. The story of how one engineer's unauthorized modifications created such a devastatingly effective weapon system remains highly relevant to contemporary military thinking. Innovation can emerge from unexpected sources when necessity meets opportunity, and individual initiative is allowed to flourish. Gunn had refused to accept his family's imprisonment as inevitable or permanent. He refused to accept that existing weapons were adequate for the tactical situation he faced. He refused to accept regulations and procedures that prevented potentially life-saving innovations from being tested in combat. That refusal to accept limitations, combined with exceptional technical skill and General Kenny's crucial support, produced modifications that fundamentally changed Pacific warfare. The B-25 Strafer destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels, eliminated thousands of enemy troops, and contributed measurably to Allied victory. Innovation can indeed come from the most unexpected sources and succeed through completely unorthodox methods when circumstances demand revolutionary solutions. The modified B-25 Strafer was certainly not the single weapon that won World War II in the Pacific. That victory required contributions from millions of people using thousands of different weapons and tactics over 4 years of incredibly complex global conflict. But the modified B-25 achieved effects completely disproportionate to its relatively small numbers. The aircraft represented what became possible when absolute necessity met unexpected opportunity, when personal motivation perfectly aligned with military requirements, when one determined individual decided that failure and surrender were completely unacceptable options. The weapon system was literally born in a maintenance hangar from one father's desperation to strike back at his family's captors. It flew into combat at masthead height, with all guns blazing and bombs skipping across water to slam into enemy hulls and explode below the waterline. It systematically destroyed Japanese hopes of resupplying their isolated forward garrisons. It shortened the war measurably. It saved countless Allied lives. And ultimately, it freed one family from 3 years and 14 days of imprisonment and uncertainty, which was exactly the point all along.